Shabbat Shalom, Parashat Devarim, the beginning of the Sefer of Devarim, Shabbat Chazon. We are on the eve of Tisha B'Av, in which we are going to remember the destruction of both Batei Mikdash and generations upon generations of Jewish suffering. And yet, here we are starting a new Sefer, a final long monologue of Moshe Rabbeinu as he prepares for his final days on earth. Our parasha begins with this monologue that Moshe speaks to the Jewish people and goes on for a very, very long time. For 5 weeks, Moshe Rabbeinu details everything that has occurred over the last few years. Everything that has transpired to the Jewish people during the 40 years of walking through the desert. But careful examination of his words leaves us very perplexed, wondering why Moshe Rabbeinu chooses again and again to simply alter the storyline. In fact, it seems to be that Moshe Rabbeinu is rewriting history. The stories don't match. He changes the order of things. He changes responsibilities. In fact, it seems to be that everything that has occurred is all by the initiative of the Jewish people and by the fault of the Jewish people. Very strange in terms of how he presents things. It makes us step back and reflect. What is the true objective of this long monologue that Moshe Rabbeinu is stating? It really opens the door to a broader and greater question. The text, the language style of entire Sefer, is in singular language. In fact, it seems to be that Moshe Rabbeinu is actually speaking here. These are all Moshe Rabbeinu's words. So much so that Chazal actually said that the entire Sefer of Devarim, Moshe Rabbeinu mipi atzmo amara. Moshe Rabbeinu said it on by himself. What? Our holy Torah has words that Moshe Rabbeinu said by himself, which means that this is not divine words? Is that possible? How could we possibly say such a terrible thing? The Rambam states that anyone that says that a single letter of the Torah is not directly from God, that is not divine, is an apikoros, is one that rejects the entire Torah. The foundation of Torah is based on the idea that every single syllable in the entire Torah is divinely inspired, directly given by God to Moshe. So the language here is rather perplexing. In fact, it seems to be, well, my favorite explanation to this is, that Moshe Rabbeinu indeed gave a very, very, very long monologue at the last part of his life. His speech, his discussion with the Jewish people had a very particular purpose. And it was far more extensive than what we see before us in Sefer Devarim. But it was done so perfectly, with such powerful potency to it, that God then says to Moshe, Moshe, these words will be entered into my Torah. These are the words that you should put in. And then God, acting as the final editor, so to speak, tells Moshe exactly which words and which sentences to put into the final version of the Torah as we were presented. And therefore every single word becomes a holy word of God himself. We are introduced to this more powerfully at the end of the Chumash. In Parashat Zot HaBracha, when Moshe Rabbeinu receives the amazing title of Ish HaElokim, as the commentaries explain, the man who has mastered the word of God so much, so deeply, in which he started speaking as if God himself was speaking. But here Moshe Rabbeinu alters the text, and perhaps it is described most powerfully by the perspective that Moshe Rabbeinu has of the Jewish people. When he looks at this young generation that is ready to enter the land, he still sees them as young children, as he titles them, Uvneihem asher lo yad'u hayom tov v'ra. And your children that do not know today good or bad. They don't know today the right way to walk. They are still so naive and have so much to learn. And Moshe indeed is very worried and concerned that as they enter the land of Israel, they will not be properly prepared. And all of the years of preparation in the desert still have not been enough. And as every parent that has to let his child go, so too Moshe Rabbeinu, as the ultimate leader, facing the end of his life, is having a hard time letting the Jewish people go and letting the Jewish people stand on their own. They are very worried. And so is he, worried that indeed they will not be fully prepared. So he gives them a last powerful message in which he goes back and reviews their history, but from the perspective not of a historical reenactment, but rather from the perspective of saying, my children, the easiest thing for a child, the easiest thing for a nation to do is to blame everyone else but yourself. But if you want to be able to be properly prepared for the future, if you want to learn from the mistakes of history, you must take the mistakes of history upon yourself. You must look at history from the perspective of, what did we do wrong? What did we miss in our behavior that did not lead us in a better path? How can we ensure that we not repeat the same mistakes over and over again? In fact, if we look back at the stories that transpired, it is not a question of who exactly initiated things and who said what and how and when, but rather it is a question of, what did we learn from these events? What should we have done as a nation to set an environment in which these things should not transpire? What should we do in the future as a nation to ensure that we don't repeat these mistakes? From that perspective, even the punishment that was befolded on Moshe Rabbeinu himself, even the punishment not to enter into the land of Israel, is really a consequence of the behavior of the Jewish people themselves. And so Moshe Rabbeinu states, Gam bi tanaf Hashem biglalchem lemor, gam ata lo tavo shama. Indeed, when those 12 spies came back from the land, and you listened to the 10 of them, and as a result you were punished to wander around the deserts for 40 years. I too was punished all the way back then because of you, not to enter the land. Of course, it had a lot to do with the style of leadership of Moshe Rabbeinu and the disconnect that he developed over the years from the people, the actions that happened when he struck the stone instead of speaking. But that was from Moshe's perspective. That is not the moral values that a nation needs to take, but rather the moral value has to be, why did we not learn over the 40 years to be different than our forefathers? Why were we not more capable to understand the commitment that we need to have in the power of prayer? In fact, Moshe Rabbeinu allows the people to reflect correctly upon history. And as he laments, Eicha Esa levadi torchachem u'ma'asachem v'rivchem, how shall I carry the burden all by myself of your squabbling and fighting nature? He reflects back to be able to say to the children, my children, every year when you read the story of Eicha, when you lament over the destruction of Yerushalayim, your reflection should not be what happened in history, but rather your reflection should be, what could we have done as a people to change the tide of history? And how are we supposed to reflect the years to come while carrying the burden without squabbling, without fighting? How are we supposed to carry the burden as a united nation to ensure that the great building that God has granted us in our generation will stand fast, will continue to flourish and grow, and will not face another horrific consequence? And so Moshe Rabbeinu asks us to reflect both backwards and forward and stand strong and understand what our journey and task really is. I wish upon all of you an easy and meaningful fast. May this be the final year in which we wander through the endless years of desert, in which we will be all worthy of seeing the Redeemer come upon us. And next year, perhaps, we shall be able to celebrate this day, Kara Alai Moed, in the building of the new, strong, and powerful temple that God will build for us in our country. Shabbat Shalom and Tzom Kal.